Would you mind just starting by telling me a little bit about Behavioral Crossroads and why you created it in the first place?
Okay, so I did not create Behavioral Crossroads. Behavioral Crossroads was an existing outpatient facility catering to the wider community. About 4 years ago, they approached me about focusing energies on the Jewish community, those suffering with addiction in the Jewish community. And so we tailor-made a program, and we created housing together. We worked together to create housing for that program, which would allow someone who is an addict within the Jewish community, specifically someone who perhaps felt uncomfortable in the traditional treatment centers, which are very Christian-based, and even more uncomfortable with the idea that perhaps they weren't getting kosher food in some facilities, or they couldn't pray as they wished, or the centers weren't necessarily sensitive to their religious needs. So we created a program that really caters to the needs of those in the Jewish community who are suffering from addiction. So I didn't, again, Behavioral Crossroads existed beforehand, but what I've been able to come on board with them is to work together to create this unique package geared towards those who are suffering from addiction in the Jewish community and as well as the Orthodox Jewish community.
Gotcha. Okay. And you mentioned a few ways that it's different from traditional recovery centers, being kosher food, giving them spaces to pray. Can you talk a little bit more about those and why those were so important to bring about?
Sure. So let's actually take a step back for a second. Spirituality is a very crucial component to recovery. The idea of understanding that I live for a purpose, that constantly asking yourself, what am I needed for, rather than what do I need, is a crucial component to recovery. Because when we live on a very selfish level, essentially, anything goes. If it's selfish, it's okay. What feels best for me, and what it gives me the most pleasure. And in that case, if in the moment addiction, feeding the addiction is what feels best, then there's no reason why not to. But when you live on a little bit of a selfless level, when you ask yourself every morning, what does the world need of me, then you cannot necessarily afford to feed the addiction, because it hinders and does not allow one to fulfill and see their mission through. Now, of course, there's the chemical component, which is dealt with in detox, etc., and in treatment. But at the end of the day, once the chemical addiction goes, then it becomes a psychological and a spiritual-based addiction or challenge. And what we need to do is fill those who are in recovery with a sense of purpose and meaning, both within their own lives and in their lives as in the context of where they stand in the world. So spirituality, a sense of purpose or a sense of appreciating what's outside of ourselves, is key. Now, spirituality has many formats of spirituality, and some of that can be religion. Now, for someone who's coming from a very religious background, there's a tremendous advantage in attacking the addiction, because they have an inherent understanding of a sense of purpose, living for a higher power. And so religion can be a very, very beautiful part of recovery. Unfortunately, if someone is of one faith and is seeking treatment in a facility that is dominated by another faith, that could backfire, because that could create a situation where the addict is uncomfortable, and being in a comfortable setting is important. And then if they're uncomfortable and they're learning things, or they're being introduced to concepts, spiritual concepts or religious concepts, that they have a tremendous inborn resistance to. It could be the difference between seeking treatment and not seeking treatment. On top of that, you also have the component where someone who's living a certain religious lifestyle might have certain religious obligations that are not necessarily catered to in a traditional treatment facility. So in light of all of these concerns, taking a look at the Orthodox community, which is heavy on the ritualistic experiences, and seeing that there were no facilities that offered, certainly facilities offered kosher meals, but if they offered a kosher meal, it was a TV dinner. It wasn't a catered meal. You were different. If you were Jewish and you were kosher and you went to a traditional treatment facility, you're different. And you are adapting to the best of your abilities to a traditional facility. And oftentimes people don't want to take that step. And then there was the concern that with many people in addiction who were expressing the concern, hey, I'm Jewish and I'm going to go to a recovery center and they're going to push Christian ideas on me, or whatever other faith ideas that I do not want to be introduced to, and therefore I'm just not going to seek treatment. And so having our staff trained into the sensitivities of the rituals and the customs within the Jewish community, having a kosher chef, having therapists and tech who are also of the Jewish faith. Some are, some aren't, but clearly who are trained to the needs of the Jewish community, creates the environment, the comfortable environment where whether you are Jewish or not, you do not feel different for practicing your faith, and that allows us to capitalize on the inherent and the ingrained, or the natural faith that the addict may come to us with, to capitalize that, to help them use that faith to further develop their sense of purpose, so that the treatment can be maximum effective.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Yes, definitely.
Too much of a sermon?
No, that was very helpful. And then in terms of actually seeking treatment within the Orthodox Jewish community, are there any challenges unique to this community besides the fact that a lot of these recovery centers are Christian faith-based?
There are major challenges. Some are consistent across treatments, period, and some are unique to the Jewish community. So let's start with general challenges that we encounter in addiction in general, and that is that we treat an addict as a bad person in society. We do not recognize that the addiction is a disease. So we are oftentimes not willing to admit that the problem exists within our own homes or own communities. So these are general problems that exist within the world at large when it comes to addiction, and our challenges that there's constant data to try to come up with best practices, or constant discussions on best practices and how to combat that element. Now, within the Jewish community, you have other elements that are very, very challenging when it comes to trying to get someone into treatment. Of course, you have the elements not in my, it doesn't exist in my community. We go to schools all the time. The school says, "Why do you want to come talk to us? We don't have an addiction problem." When I know that 3 of their students are already at our facility. So they say, "We don't have an addiction problem. We don't have anyone who's ever had that challenge," because the moment you admit that you have a problem, the schools or the communities are worried that they're going to be looked down upon because of their inherent misunderstanding of what addiction really is, and that is it's a disease. So you have the problem in the Jewish community, but because the community is a much more tight-knit community, the challenges become more. I'm trying to think the right word, but the challenges become more exposed, because, say, for example, in a family who's in the Jewish community, there's marriages are everyone knows each other within a community, so there's family reputations. And if someone's looking, dating a girl or wanting to date a girl whose brother is an addict, well, now all of a sudden the parents are going to put a lot of pressure on that boy to say, hey, why are you dating someone who has addiction to family? Is that the type of family you want to be associated with? And so the families are motivated to hide the fact that someone is in addiction, and sometimes hiding that challenge of being an addict does not allow for seeking of treatment. So there's the pressure on that end, and of course education is key here, and just a lack of an education of an understanding, a lack of access to resources. A lot of times in the Orthodox communities, perhaps they won't necessarily have access to the internet or to certain certain knowledgeable resources, or certain resources that are put out by the county or the state or nonprofits that maybe the Orthodox community doesn't have access to because of their lack of access to again, in some communities, to the internet, and so they don't know the resources that are out there to having trouble, and so they're not talking about it, which each addict thinks they're the only one going through their challenge, and then all of a sudden they have nowhere to turn to, and before you know it, God forbid, there's an overdose, and then that's hushed up because no one wants to be labeled as someone so they'll tell them that they died of a heart attack or an aneurysm, etc., and they're misrepresenting, and so no one gets the information, and no one realizes the severity of the disease and the epidemic that is going on. Now, I will say this: 30, 40 years ago, there was also an addiction problem. 100 years ago, there was also an addiction problem. 1,000 years ago, there was also an addiction problem. There's been an addiction problem since Noah became an alcoholic after the Great Flood. But the addiction today is killing people a lot quicker than the addiction of yesteryear. An alcoholic, it took 30, 40 years before the effects of the alcoholism was really felt in a public sphere where it was a medical effect, rather than, just the abuse that going on in a home or et cetera. There was a lot more functionability for the addict within the community, so we didn't have to address it. Today, one badly laced batch of heroin with fentanyl, or even fentanyl-laced marijuana, or the potency of the crack cocaine today, and it's lights out, and that's it. We're done, and there's an overdose, and that is becoming a greater problem. But it is also allowing us to create more of an awareness, because there's a greater fear about what could happen if someone, that in an instant a life could end. And so now we're starting to see the communities take it a lot more seriously, and starting to be more open to hearing about the challenges of addiction and maybe some of the solutions.
Okay. And have you seen an improvement in terms of preventative education as well?
It's a good question. There's always improvement. Yes, there is improvement. Is it on par where it should be? Absolutely not. I mean, the problem keeps getting worse, which means we're not doing enough. And more people are suffering. Now, addiction, here's the thing. Addiction is a symptom of a problem, usually. People don't just become addicts because they are excited about experimenting with drugs. Some people do, but it's rare. Usually, addiction is a symptom of a deeper problem, usually a mental health problem. So the question really isn't so much, are we seeing an improvement in the education from an addiction standpoint? The question I think we need to ask ourselves is, are we seeing an improvement from the underlying issue, which is a mental health issue? Are we seeing any sort of improvement to dealing with that? And in some cases, and a lot of cases actually, unfortunately, we find that the original underlying issue might be sexual abuse, which exists. And are we doing enough to combat sexual abuse in the community? Are we doing enough to combat and to bring awareness to the other mental health issues, whether it's OCD or bipolar disease, etc.? And oftentimes when people don't have the resources to do that, so then they turn to drugs and alcohol to self-medicate for those issues. So it's not just is there more information on addiction or drug use? Is there more education and information in the community? To answer that, yes, of course you could say yes, there's more. But that would be to ignore really what we need to target, and that is an overarching and comprehensive understanding of what leads people to become addicts in the first place. And to answer that question, yes, there is more being done. There's gradually a deeper understanding of the root causes of the problems of addiction. But clearly, as long as the numbers continue to show us that people are suffering more and more and turning to alcohol and drugs and substances and more and more, then clearly we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, are we doing enough? And the answer then is no, we're not doing enough. So has there been an improvement? Yes. We're starting to take our heads out of the sand. Is it enough? Absolutely not. It's nowhere near enough, which is why I'm grateful for you to reaching out to us to write an article on this issue, because now it's one tiny more step further down this road to say, we're making one more person aware, and which is why I'm taking an hour out of my day to talk to you, because now if even one person reads your article and says, wow, there are others who are suffering like I am, and there are resources available out there, not just Crossroads, but there are resources across the board within the Jewish community that are popping up, and someone then takes, even one person takes the time to reach out and to seek guidance and help, then my time and your time and Michael's time and all our time has been put to the greatest use, because we are saving that life. And what could be more precious than saving even one single life?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm happy to be writing this and appreciate your time. I'm wondering, do you know anyone, maybe advocates or activists who are in this community, have come out and might be willing to speak on the record about their experiences?
Yes. There's a dear friend of mine who works very closely with me. His name is Michael Safer. Michael spent many years as an addict and now goes and talks to people about his experience. But not only that, he has a great personal relationship he has a great personal rapport with people who are suffering from addiction, and he'll wake up any time of day and night. He'll drive anywhere he needs to go. He'll travel anywhere to meet one-on-one with someone and to talk to them about his experiences and to encourage them to seek the help that they need to get the help they need. And Michael doesn't work for any one facility. He knows all the resources out there, and so when someone reaches out to him for help, or he meets someone who is looking for help, he knows exactly where to send them and how to help. And he'd be happy to talk about his experience both as an addict. Michael's in long-term recovery, but also in his efforts to try to help those within the community who are suffering from addiction.
Okay, great. Yeah, I would love to talk to him. Maybe I'll follow up with the other Michael on here for his contact information through you after this, if that works.
Absolutely, and I can put it on the email that was going around. I'll shoot him a text just letting him know that you're good, that you might reach out to him. But
great.
I'm positive that he'd be happy to share his experiences as someone who grew up in the Orthodox community, still lives in the Orthodox community, part of the Orthodox community, who was an addict. I guess in some sense, you're always an addict, and that's how addicts, the addicts see themselves. But again, he went through, and he's in recovery. He's in long-term recovery, and he's definitely doing amazing things with his life. So.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to speak to him. That sounds good. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you, didn't touch on, that you think is important to include?
I think it's important also to understand the positive elements of it. First of all, two things. Recovery, while traditionally, again, specifically because you're going to be focused on the Jewish, the recovery in the Jewish community, it's important that people who may not be familiar, the the 12 steps is like the holy grail within I use that term lightly, but the holy grail within the addiction community of recovery. And I believe very much in the 12 steps. I buy into it, and it's a great program. There's a misconception that the 12 steps are very Christian-based, and they're not. Actually, a lot of the 12 steps have roots within Judaism and Jewish faith. So it's very important, I think, that people understand that, and when they read these articles, and maybe they're suffering, or maybe they have a family member who are suffering, that they read these articles and understand that there is a Jewish, there's Jewish elements to it, not only Jewish elements, but it encompasses core Jewish principles. Second thing I would like to say is that it's very important that people who are suffering from addiction or their families not be ashamed of what they're going through. Just like someone who's going through a struggle with diabetes will not be ashamed to reach out to a diabetes support group, or to reach out to other people who have been through diabetes, or will not hesitate to get the help they need because they want to live. So too, someone who's living in addiction has to recognize its disease. They can't be ashamed of the addiction. And again, in the Jewish community, that shame is so prevalent. A third thing I will say is on that same topic is that we who are community leaders, we have to educate ourselves how not to shame those who are in addiction, not to stand up on the pulpit and call someone who's maybe going through the challenges of addiction a junkie. Because if you label them a junkie, then the person hears it and says, well, I'm not going to go seek guidance and counsel from my rabbi or from my community leader, because they're just going to judge me. They're going to look down upon me, and they're going to think that I'm just a junkie. I'm just worthless. So we must build up. We must not be afraid to talk about it from the pulpit, but talk about it in a positive way, where we will reserve judgment. We will not judge those who are struggling, because if those who are struggling don't have, or their family members don't have somewhere to turn to, then I guarantee you they're not going to get help. So in order to get help, we need to make it easy and accessible for them to get help, and encourage those. So whether it's through posts on social media, if you're a communal leader and you have access to social media, post something about it on social media. Offer your services. Say if you're struggling, reach out, and then educate yourself as a leader to what are the resources. Someone comes to you with addiction, realize that you're not a professional necessarily. You're not going to be able to cure them. It's a disease. You need to go to an expert. So who are the experts in my area that deal with the disease of addiction? Reach out to your local emergency room hospital to say, okay, someone comes to me with an addiction problem. What are my resources? What are the steps? Get educated. Go online. Read. And educate yourself as a leader, as a communal leader, as someone who's concerned within their community. These are crucial steps that people need to take. Don't wait to be reactive to a situation. Be proactive, even if you don't know someone in addiction. I promise you really do know someone who's in addiction. They just haven't made it known to you yet. But if you educate yourself and you become proactive, and then you go out and put something on social media, you open yourself up to having that conversation, they will come out of the woodwork, and they will be grateful for it. They will be grateful to unleash the burden to share with someone that they are going through this tremendous, tremendous challenge. And then if someone is dealing with a family member who's suffering, don't just ignore the problem. Get educated. Help them recognize that it is a problem, and really the only way someone can get help is if they want help. And encourage them to seek help. Don't be embarrassed about the stigma that it might put on the family. So these are things that I think are crucial that the world needs to know and understand about when dealing with addiction, and even more so within the Jewish community, because I feel that we're not doing enough to send that particular message to our community at large. There is help. It's available. There are resources. They're available. It's just a matter of reaching out and not being ashamed about reaching out for help.